was essentially on the introductions to economics. We talked a bit about specialization and trade. Can anyone quickly summarize specialization and trade in one sentence? Lucas.
You were here. Specialization is someone specialized to do something.
Okay. What are the benefits of specialization? Haley.
Each person does what they're good at, so it's like easier and like more efficient.
Okay, perfect.
No.
Okay. After you specialize in producing something, what do you do with that?
You get a job. That is a job, I think.
After countries are specialized, yeah.
You trade with
Perfect.
other countries.
You trade with other countries that have a lower opportunity cost, I suppose, or for countries where it is easier for them to produce something. Then we talked a bit about supply and demand. We got through this very fun graph. As supply changes, as price changes, and as quantity changes, a variety of other factors also change. The intersection between the supply and the demand line is the
Curve.
point. Supply and demand curve is the point at which there is an optimal production. So, for example, if the price is over here, companies are going to produce exactly this much in order to meet the price. Obviously, this isn't perfect, but generally speaking, companies optimize for the graph. Okay, then we talked a bit about price elasticity.
Oh.
Elasticity is basically the ability of prices to reflect, the ability of the change in price to be reflected in demand. So for example, if your bananas become 2 times expensive tomorrow, you're probably not going to buy bananas. However, if medicines become 2 times more expensive, then you are likely to buy medicines because you need medicines, because otherwise you're going to die, especially if you have like a disease, for example. Which is why companies can get away with increasing the price of some goods relative to other goods. It's the reason for why big pharmaceutical companies in places like the US have gotten away with increasing the price of medications like insulin, despite the fact that most people can't afford this, which is why they have to do things like get into debt in order for them to just afford basic goods, medical goods like insulin. So price elasticity is essentially the reflection in demand as a consequence of change in price. Okay, why might something be inelastic? There are a variety of reasons for this. The first is that the good is a necessity, like basic medication, like water, for example. After a drought, after a war, food and water become incredibly expensive, even basic stuff like grains and wheat, because of the fact that people need that in order for them to survive. Second, there are very few substitutes available for the good. If your iPhone becomes like 3 times expensive tomorrow, you're probably not going to buy an iPhone because you can substitute that with another product. But if something that doesn't have a substitute becomes more expensive and you need that good, then obviously you're going to end up doing this. So in order for something to become inelastic, there generally needs to be no relative substitutes available for that product. Third, many goods become inelastic during times of crisis just because of the fact that there's just a surge in demand for those kinds of things. So price goes up, the price goes up while demand goes up. A common example of this is like energy, when you have energy crisis, toilet paper at the start of COVID for some reason, this goes on. There are 4 simple scenarios when you're drawing the supply and demand curve. Either your supply goes up, your supply goes down, your demand goes up, or your demand goes down. All of these things are reflected in the graph. If your supply goes up, then your price goes down. If your demand goes up, then your price goes up, because now there's more people trying to buy something. A common way to visualize this is think about like an auctions market or like a farmer's market where people are trying to buy a bunch of stuff but there's only limited amounts of that good. That's generally how basic economic markets work as well. We talked a bit about economic markets as well. Profitability, all companies are profit motivated, but lots of companies nowadays have started to trade off short-term profits in order for long-term profits, in order for them to gain a pretty large portion of the market. Common examples are Uber and Amazon. They were able to reduce their prices and then go into a loss in the short run in order for them to later make a higher profit, because their goal at that point was to increase market share. So if your goal is to increase market share, at some point it's actually good to have a short-term loss in order to capture a larger portion of the market, drive out competition, and then be able to increase prices and then be able to become profitable. Lots of companies also become profitable when they have economies of scale. This means they have lots of different people purchasing their products, so the lower they can benefit from the same relative cost, because now they're selling more products, so they can be able to pay their fixed costs. Fixed costs are costs that you have to pay irrespective of however many people buy your product. For example, if you own a factory, the rent on that factory is a fixed cost. And what that means is regardless of however many people buy your products, if 2 million people buy your buy your piece of clothing, or 0 people buy your clothing, you're still going to have to pay that 2 million. The same applies if you have workers and you have contracted them out for a certain amount of time. Regardless of however many people come and buy that product, you still need to pay that group of people that amount of money. So as long as you're making incremental money on every single transaction, the question you should ask then is that amount of money sufficient for you to cover your fixed costs? For example, if I'm making $1 on every single piece of merchandise that I sell, but the amount of fixed costs that I have is $2,000 because the place I'm renting at is like $2,000 a year, for example, then I need to sell over 2,000 of that product in order for me to start making an actual profit. So there's a gross profit and there's a net profit. Your net profit is basically after you remove all of your expenses, not just the incremental expenses in making that product. So there's a cost associated with making a product, there's a cost associated with operating the business. These are two very different things. So you need to make money at the gross level, which is the amount of money that you make on a product, but you also need to make money at the net level, which is the amount of money that you make as a business after you've taken out all the expenses. That was very quick, but does everyone understand or not?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Competition. Competition is basically when there are lots of different companies trying to compete in the market. They compete by doing a variety of things. You lower prices in order to make your product more desirable relative to other products. So you buy in lots of situations you buy the cheaper product. Secondly, you might improve quality. So if your prices aren't much lower, your quality might be much higher, which is why people might try and buy your product. You might also spend a lot of time advertising in order to create a cult of personality around your brand. A common example of this is like iPhones, for example. The huge reason for why they're popular is because of the amount of money that Apple dedicates in their advertisements. So spending lots of money on advertisements increases demand artificially in some situations by making your product seem more desirable. But they also increase the amount of awareness that people have about your product, which is a reason for why they might buy your product more. Like if you're aware of a new technology that has been released as a consequence of advertising, you might be more inclined to go and buy that. Like if the iPhone 17 Pro was released and no one really knew about it because Apple never spent time advertising it, then you would assume demand would be lower than it is right now. So advertising is quite common. Lastly is a takeover. This is quite common, but it's actually becoming, it's relatively new, but it's actually becoming quite common. Takeovers are when big companies go out and like buy smaller companies. A common example of this is Facebook. Facebook bought up Instagram and WhatsApp, and then they were able to control all 3 of those under the Meta label. So in lots of situations, the ways companies are able to take out competition is by just buying the other company. So if Haley has a company that competes with my company, I can offer Haley shareholders a set amount of money, and if they accept that money, then I control Haley's company essentially now. And then that company falls under the structure of my company, and I own that company and this company. This is becoming incredibly popular. This is a huge reason for why investment banks are also becoming really rich nowadays. The reason why is because they're the ones that preside over mergers and acquisitions. Mergers are basically the same as acquisitions, except it's 2 companies coming together and forming a bigger company. There are generally rules around takeovers. Okay, we'll get to this in a second. Monopolies are situations in which there is one big company in the market. So, for example, if you have only like one phone company in the market, then that's a monopoly because you don't have any other alternatives. Similarly, if you only have one social media company to go to, that's a monopoly. The reason monopolies happen is generally for a few reasons. The first is that there are sometimes high barriers to entry. So, for example, if you're a pharmaceutical company, the ability for you to be able to break into the pharmaceutical industry is pretty large because, for example, you need to spend a lot of money on research, you need to spend a lot of money on expensive researchers, you need to spend a lot of money on gaining access to patents in order for you to have a laboratory, etc. This just means it's very hard for new firms to be able to open up there because before you start making profit, you have to have a prolonged period of time where you're making a loss. Right? Like you have to spend time researching before you have something to sell and then start making a profit. So in those sets of situations, there's generally a high barrier to entry, which is why there's sometimes no competition. This obviously can be corrected in ways like some pharmaceutical company, I forgot its name, started out as a milk company, and then the company had a subsidiary that became a pharmaceutical company, and then that pharmaceutical company became large. Similarly, lots of rich people invest in this, so they're willing to take the short-term loss in order for them to make a long-term profit, which is why you have lots of industries like cars, for example, where the initial short-term cost is high, but in the long run, there just are lots of companies there. Lastly, artificially, you can eliminate competition and create a monopoly. So Walmart did this quite commonly, where, for example, they reduce the prices when they enter into a new neighborhood in order to drive out other grocery stores. And then after those grocery stores shut down, they started increasing prices because now there's no competition for you. So this is a common strategy that companies end up using in order for them to establish control over that market. Monopolies are harmful for a few reasons. First, because they engage in price fixing. Look at all of the pharmaceutical companies in the US where the price of products is just too high. Second, because they're generally inefficient. Because if you have no incentive to want to reduce your cost because you're not competing with another company, then companies end up becoming really, really inefficient. So it might be better for you to like cut down on labor. It might be better for you to move overseas. It might be better for you to do X, Y, or Z. But companies just don't end up doing that because they have no relative force that they're competing with. Comparatively, if you have competition, then you have to do things like cut costs constantly in order for you to like make your products cheaper. Because if the cost of your products goes down, then you can make the price of those products lower, and therefore you're able to outcompete other companies. Does that make sense? So monopolies generally lead to inefficiency. Lastly, they lead to thirdly, they lead to lower quality because now you have no incentive to compete on the basis of quality. Because if people are going to buy an iPhone, regardless of how good the quality of that phone is, then there's no real incentive for you to want to try and improve on quality. Fourth, they lead to this innovation because you're not competing, so you don't have to like outcompete other companies and now be more innovative. Lastly, they can lead to price and quality discrimination. This happens quite unfortunately in a lot of developing countries, where, for example, the price of products if you live in a rural area or if you're a minority is higher than the price of products if you live in an urban area and part of the majoritarian group, because of the fact that companies exploit those people because they know for a variety of reasons, often social. Okay, that was very quick as well. Did everyone understand that?
Yes.
Great. Natural monopolies are a specific type of monopoly. Basically, they're industries where it is beneficial for there to be one company. So lots of industries, it's good for you to have competition, right? The majority of industries, it's good to have competition. But in some unique sets of industries, it's good for you to have natural monopolies. A common example of this is transportation. If you had lots of different like transportation companies, then it would be expensive. It would be more expensive for you to take a trip because now you don't have the same efficient railway systems, for example, because of the fact there are high fixed costs. So now you have like lots of public infrastructure, lots of different roads, which just leads to a lot of inefficiencies. So the reasons why like public transport, transport in most places is somewhat cheap, like $5 to go from anywhere to another place in Victoria. It's just because of the fact there's only one company that controls the entire operations. So they're able to subsidize the entire scope of operations because they have lots of customers that come to them. So in some situations, it's beneficial. Similarly, telecommunications. There is really, really high cost to operating like a satellite or operating a telecommunication tower. What this means is that if you have lots of telecommunication towers and people are competing on the basis of those companies, then you're making less money at a gross level per transaction, which means you have to charge a higher amount of money in order to cover those fixed costs. Right? Like if it costs me $10 million to operate a telecommunications tower, but I'm only making $1 off of each person, and I have a fixed number of customers, which is like 1 million, then I need to be charging them $10, not $1, in order for me to cover my fixed costs. Make sense? Great. Governments fix monopolies in places where it is inefficient to have monopolies through something known as antitrust. Antitrust legislation is essentially laws that seek to promote competition and prevent monopolies from forming. So, for example, in the US, you have the Federal Trade Commission. So, in lots of situations when they engage in bad behavior, the Federal Trade Commission steps in and regulates those companies. And if you want to engage in, for example, a takeover or a merger of another company, you need approval from these regulatory agencies. And in lots of situations, regulatory agencies don't approve your merger or acquisition on the basis that you might now be a monopoly because you control too much of the market. So, just know that there's sometimes antitrust legislation. Some antitrust legislation is better than others. The US is notoriously bad at antitrust legislation. Think about all the monopolies that exist there, Amazon, all the pharmaceutical companies, the tech giants, the cars, etc. But in some sets of situations, antitrust does work pretty well. Like Australia has decent antitrust legislation, etc. Okay, there are monopolies to an extent, but there is still some competition, right? Because you have Coles, Woolies, you have, what's the other one?
That's pretty much it.
Aldi, there is another one, I forgot the name.
Walmart? No, I've seen like one Walmart.
But yeah, there are some places competition. But if Coles and Woolies try to merge tomorrow and become this really big company, the Australia would essentially just block that from happening. So they wouldn't let those companies merge because then you control like 90% of the market basically because they're the two biggest companies there. The way you evaluate whether or not you should ban a merger and acquisition is using something known as the Consumer Welfare Standard. The Consumer Welfare Standard is out of scope for now. We'll discuss this a bit more maybe. Actually, I won't be able to discuss this with you, but I'll get Tony to discuss this with you if you're staying at this batch next semester. And if you're moving up to the other batch, then I'll discuss the Consumer Welfare Standard versus the Citizen Welfare Standard next semester as well. Okay. We talked about this. Antitrust can also be used to break up companies. So if companies are engaging in bad behavior, you can just break up those companies. For example, in 1911, the United States took the American Tobacco Company and basically broke it up because they saw them as a monopoly in the tobacco industry. And then there's like a bunch of antitrust laws that came about here. You don't need to know the specifics of these laws at this point in your debating career. But if you end up debating at like uni tournaments, for example, knowing what the Sherman Antitrust Act is might be quite beneficial for you, especially if you end up like debating at like international tournaments or state teams, for example. So for now, let's just skip over them. We talked about natural monopolies. Yeah, natural monopolies are not inherently good or inherently bad. They're just places where it's efficient for you to have a big company. Having a natural monopoly does not mean the government does not need to regulate. It just means government needs to regulate in those places. So they have tendencies to act in bad ways, but if the government regulates them sufficiently, then they won't act in bad ways. Okay.
I feel like he skipped over a lot of slides. Oh, there's 5.
Did I?
Nobody cares. I feel like he skipped some.
Oh, wait, did I? Oh, nice. But basically, chill. That actually took a lot sooner than I thought it would. Does everyone understand what natural monopolies are?
Yeah.
I wrote them. Okay, great. Let me try and
Natural.
find. Oh.
Natural.
That's essentially it for the slides right now.
Wait, no, you have some-
Though that's all of economics that you need to know for a debate. There is some additional stuff that we might go through now, but you won't need to know that for the majority of debates that we do. Let me find the stuff.
Stop talking then. You didn't have to say that so loud. Stop sniffing glue. You're gonna get high. No friends, have you? Down. Other date.
Okay. I am.
Hey guys.
Hey Lucas, did you know that if you died, you're dead?
Okay, we'll talk a bit about the labor market. The labor market is basically the market where workers try and go and access essential jobs. The labor market basically refers, actually I'll just chat this in. This is a write-up on Econ 101. I might send this out to you guys. It has a lot of unnecessary details that you won't need to know at this point, but have a skim through it, read through it, understand some of it. Okay.
Economics 101.
Yeah. Labor.
Economics.
Labor essentially refers to workers who are willing to work at a company for wage. You can get labor for a variety of reasons. Like for example, if you provide a service to a company, they might pay you for that. If you like produce something for the company, they might pay you for that. Labor markets are incredibly similar to other financial markets that you might experience, in the sense that supply and demand basically operates in a labor market in the same way that it would operate in a goods market. For example, if you have lots of workers trying to compete for a job, then the price or the salaries for those jobs go down because now the company can get away with paying lower amounts of money because people are more desperate. Similarly, if companies, for example, have lots of people trying to get a job, then the wages for those jobs are higher, which is why specialized industries generally tend to pay more because there are few people who are qualified enough to work in those specialized industries. Obviously, this is relative to demand, right? Like if you have 20 people who are incredibly educated at this very niche subject that nobody cares about, then obviously the wages are going to be low there. But if there is sufficient demand for that service and there's only a very few number of people who are educated, then in those situations wages go up. So obviously when I say high demand for work and low demand for work. That's relative to the demand for the service itself. Yes.
Wouldn't like work have high demand because it pays a lot?
Sorry.
Wouldn't like a labor thingamajig have a lot of demand? Like lots of people want to do that job because it pays a lot. So then why would these companies like lower the
Which labor?
before you said like if a lot of people want to do a job,
Yeah.
then the company might just like lower the salary of
Yeah,
that job.
companies lower wages in situations when there's too many people trying to work for that company.
But wouldn't a lot of people want to work for that company only because it pays a lot?
No, lots of people want to work for companies because they don't have any other jobs. Like if you think about every developing country where there is just too much demand for occupation and not that many supply of jobs. A common example of this is actually China. China has 1 billion people, and they have jobs for 1 billion people. But the problem is that if you work a manufacturing job in China or you apply for a manufacturing job, especially if you go to like regional places like Guangzhou, you have lots of people that are competing for those jobs. And the problem there is that the wages relatively go down because companies are now able to pay lower amounts of wages and people are still trying to get those jobs. Computer science, surprisingly, is also having a problem where wages are going down because there just isn't that many people, or there just isn't as many jobs as there once used to be in like 2016. Obviously, it's still somewhat high, but like it's going down relative to what it was before. Wages, you all know what this is. Minimum wage. Minimum wage is the least amount of money that you can get away with paying someone. So the problem with certain situations where there is empirically too much supply of wages and too much demand for jobs and too little supply, is that the prices could theoretically go very low. Like if there are 1,000 people competing for 10 places, you might be able to get away with charging people like $5 a day. This happens in a lot of countries, surprisingly. Like, not America, because America has minimum wage, but a lot of developing countries in particular. Lots of factory jobs there pay like $5 or $3 a day because there's just so many people trying to go for those jobs because unemployment levels are so high because they need to feed their families. So at little money is better than no money for them. So in those situations, it's like you either make $3 a day or you make no money that day. And obviously people would prefer to make some money so that they can try and feed themselves, try and feed their kids, etc. In those situations, prices can go really low. Governments regulate against this by putting a minimum wage. A minimum wage is the least amount of money that you can pay someone. So in Australia, I think the minimum wage is $20. It's 20 something. In the US, it's $10 US. Or like the federal state minimum wage is $7 US. But in specific states, the minimum wage goes up. So in some states, the minimum wage is like $20 US. But the federal minimum, which means that's the least that states can set, is that, yeah.
Don't like some restaurants pay their workers like really like low, but they let them keep their tips.
Yeah, this is another problem in certain industries. So in certain industries like hospitality, there's this very annoying trend where there's this specific way that hospitality businesses are regulated hospitality workers are regulated relative to other workers, which is that they fall in this annoying tax or like corporate bracket where you can get away with paying them a very small amount of money. Like I think the minimum wage there is like $3, but they now get to keep all of their tips. So when you go to a company, tipping culture isn't big here in Australia, but it's really big in the US because you're basically paying their salary. Because they're not getting paid that much by their company. And I know people get really annoyed at people in like restaurants having an expectation for tips in the US. But the reason they have this expectation is because they're making nothing from their employer. So the only way they're able to make money is tips. In Australia, we don't normally have that. Like you have minimum wage applying regardless of what occupation you work. But in some countries, this is a problem. There's like a really good video on this, which I might send out by today, which just talks about tipping culture in the US. It's horrible. These are just some fine reasons. You can think of reasons why a higher minimum wage is bad as well. Like a high minimum wage doesn't mean very good. Like you can have inflation if you have high minimum wages. There are a bunch of reasons why high minimum wages are bad. The first is that high minimum wage leads to higher cost to produce, right? Like for example, if you're buying a product and the workers are now charging 5 times as much, your product is going to go up in price because the companies still need to make profit, and now they have a higher cost to pay. So in some sets of situations, high minimum wages are bad. That doesn't mean low minimum wages are good, to be clear. High minimum wages being bad means, I mean, relative to like what we would consider maybe a moderate livable wage, a really high wage would be bad because now all products go up in price. A higher minimum wage also hurts small businesses more than it hurts big businesses. Can anyone think of a reason why?
Because these small businesses probably don't have like a very big like client pool, so they probably don't receive that many profits. So if
What profit are you talking about? Gross or net?
net gross. Okay. Because since they have
Does everyone remember what the difference between gross profit and net profit is? Alex, what's the difference?
Gross profit is basically the profit that you gain when you take into account how much money it takes to make that product.
No.
And net
Isn't that the net?
net is
net is
taking
like-
into account like how much money it takes to like
No,
run the
is it-
actual business and like the
Yeah,
Isn't net
so-
minusing all the expenses?
no.
Yeah, so gross
is it?
profit is the amount of profit that you make per item when you end up deducting expenses to produce that product. So if I own a pencil factory and it costs me $3 to produce a pencil, and it costs me, and I sell that pencil for $5, and I sell 1,000 pencils, then I'm making $5,000, my expenses are $3,000, my profit is $2,000. But if the rent for that factory is $3,000, then I'm in the red, right? Because now my fixed costs are different to my gross, like incremental costs. The problem with smaller companies is that they have a smaller pool of workers. So, for example, if you have a smaller pool of workers and your fixed costs are somewhat the same, it becomes harder for you to pay your workers because a smaller company that has has spent $2,000 on its factory but only sells like 1,000 of those products is more likely to be in the red than a bigger company, for example. So it's just harder for smaller companies to manage this because they're making less money writ large. Cool? Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, generally speaking, when minimum wages go up, especially really quickly, lots of companies go out of business. You create monopolies artificially by virtue of like governments increasing minimum wages, which is why the minimum wage doesn't go up to like $300 an hour. Because even though you might think it's good for you to get paid $300 an hour, if everyone is getting paid $300 an hour, everything just goes up in price.
Yeah.
That's just inflation, and lots of companies that can't afford this just go out of business. Okay. Yeah, unemployment rates are, you guys know what unemployment rates are, right?
Yep.
What's unemployment rate?
It's someone. It's like
The rate of
the
unemployment.
it's like the percentage of people who in a population who aren't employed.
So does that include kids?
No.
Does that include disabled people who can't work?
No.
No.
Wait.
No.
What? No.
No.
I think there is unemployed rates specifically.
It's in specific
said-
sections.
Yeah, it's for specific.
So it's
samples.
the group of people that are trying to find a job but can't find a job. So in lots of countries, like someone in the family doesn't work, like your mom might not work, your father might not work. Obviously, they don't contribute to the unemployment rate because they're not looking for a job. But if both of your parents are trying to look for a job, then they would both be a part of that statistic. The unemployment rate is a percentage of people in a country who are trying to find a job but can't find a job. High unemployment rates are bad because it means people don't have money, they can't pay off their loans, they can't send their kids to school, they can't put rent, they can't pay rent, they can't put food on the table, the list goes on. Unemployment takes one of 3 ways. There's frictional unemployment, which is basically when workers have left a job or in the process of transitioning into a second job. So for example, if you're a barista and you're trying to find work somewhere else, between the process of like leaving your job as a barista and trying to find that new job, you're in a process of frictional unemployment. Second is structural unemployment. This is when the skills possessed by workers are no longer needed in the economy. So for example, this is a problem with like AI. Lots of people are saying AI might lead to unemployment. The kind of unemployment they're talking about is structural unemployment. Because AI replaces some skills that workers might do for a business, they can now become redundant, which means businesses can do the work that those workers would have done and outsource it to an AI model. And this can lead to structural unemployment, where the work that these workers are doing just becomes less valuable to large. The last is cyclical unemployment. This is when the economy is in a recession. A recession is basically 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. So basically, GDP is the amount of products
Gross domestic.
gross domestic product. It's the amount of the value of all aggregate products in that economy. GDP reflects demand because companies produce more products when there is more demand. So when companies have less demand for their products, the GDP of that country goes down. The country is just producing less products. What happens when the country produces less products?
There's less supply. No,
They have this less money.
There's less money made, yes. But do you also think they need to hire less people? Like if you're a factory that only produces 5 things, do you still need the 10 people that you might have needed if you were producing like 100 things?
no, like one.
Exactly. So this creates a cyclical trend. There is a reduction in demand for a variety of reasons. For example, there might be a war in the middle of the world, and therefore it's hard for you to sell your products from one part of the world to another part of the world if you're going through that route. And what happens then is that demand for that product drops. When demand for that product drops, companies end up making less of that product because they know they can't sell it. When companies make less of that product, they fire people because now you don't need that many people anymore, right? Because you're not producing as many things. This leads to less demand, which then leads to even less supply, and this becomes a cycle. Does that make sense? So there are lots of ways that you can correct against this. We might talk about recession specifically later. We already talked about trade. Okay, that's essentially it. Does everyone understand? Great. Okay. I had like 5 minutes left, but I finally finished on time. So that's
4
nice.
minutes. 4 minutes.
4 minutes again. Yeah, Lucas.
Why are these like guides always called like something 101?
It just means a high overview. So if you take an economics class at high school, or I guess in university, you learn a lot more. Microeconomics and macroeconomics are 2 subgroups of economics. The way you evaluate micro and macro is very different. So like there are lots of different laws, lots of different formulas, etc. When you're debating, you don't have to give formulas. Like no one's going to stand up and expect you to give the formula for the price of a product relative to the elasticity of that product. That's never going to be required. But you need to understand what elasticity is. You need to understand whether a good is elastic or not, because that helps you make those arguments. Like for example, we talked about motion last week. Did you guys understand? Like there were lots of economic concepts there that were quite useful. Okay, that is essentially it for today. Let me just find a motion.
Please find the hard one.